In 1964, your mother pulled a meatloaf from the oven without checking a single thing. The pan was right. The glaze was right. She never set a timer because her hands knew before her head did. She cooked 30 different suppers that year and never wrote one of them down. Coming up at 22, a box of elbow macaroni and a can of tomatoes became the meal half of America ate twice a week. And the one waiting at 5 is a dish every woman in the country shaped by hand, and no two versions ever matched. These were suppers poured and stirred and tasted until they were done by women who never needed a printed page to tell them when. Here are 30 easy meals 1960s housewives made without a recipe. Number 30. Fried egg sandwich. Butter in a skillet, 1 egg cracked straight into the foam, a slice of white bread ready on the counter. The yolk stayed soft if she timed it right, and she always timed it right. No timer, no thermometer. She listened for the sizzle to slow down and flipped it by sound. Salt, pepper, maybe a thin slice of onion if there was one in the bin, and she pressed the top bread down flat so the yolk broke and soaked through. This was not breakfast food. This was what appeared on the plate when the grocery money was spent and Thursday was still 2 days from payday. It filled the belly, it used almost nothing, and it took 4 minutes from match strike to table. Number 29. Hamburger gravy over rice. Beef browned in its own fat, a few spoonfuls of flour stirred in until it thickened, then milk poured slowly while she scraped the bottom of the pan. That was the gravy. The rice cooked on the back burner, plain white with nothing in it but water and a pinch of salt. She spooned the gravy over the top and set out plates for the whole table. Families stretched this across 5 or 6 servings without a second thought. The drippings carried the flavor, the flour carried the weight, and the rice carried everything else. Some women added a diced onion, others shook in a few drops of hot sauce. Either way, the pot was empty by the end of supper. Before we go any further, for the folks who want more recipes like these gathered in one place, I put together the Vintage Recipe Guide. It is waiting on my website, vintagelifestyleusa.com. I will not bring it up again. If you want it, it is there. Now back to the list. Number 28, fried bologna, 1 thick slice scored around the edges so it would not curl, laid flat in a hot skillet with a little butter. It puffed up in the center and browned on the bottom, and when she flipped it, the kitchen smelled like every school cafeteria in the country. She put it between 2 slices of bread with yellow mustard and maybe a piece of American cheese if the block had not run out. Children ate this standing up at the counter. Working men ate it with a glass of milk. Nobody called it a delicacy, but nobody left it on the plate. A pack of bologna and a loaf of bread kept a family going for days, and the whole thing took less time than setting the table. Number 27. Creamed corn and hamburger skillet. Beef cooked down in the pan, a can of creamed corn poured right over the top, salt, pepper, and maybe a sprinkle of garlic powder. The whole thing simmered until it thickened into something halfway between a stew and a casserole, bubbling low around the edges. She served it straight from the skillet, sometimes over toast, sometimes by itself with nothing but a spoon. The sweetness from the corn cut through the heaviness of the beef in a way that children who refused every vegetable on earth never seemed to notice. 1 skillet, 1 burner, 10 minutes, and the kitchen barely needed cleaning. She served it and forgot about it, but the children remembered it 30 years later. Number 26. Beans and cornbread. A pot of pinto beans cooked low and slow all afternoon with a ham bone or a piece of salt pork for flavor. The cornbread went into a cast iron skillet greased with bacon fat and baked until the crust turned golden and pulled away from the edges. She never measured the cornmeal. She poured it into a bowl until it looked right, cracked an egg, added buttermilk, and stirred. When the beans were soft and the broth had turned thick and smoky, supper was ready. This was the Monday meal in half the kitchens south of the Ohio River. The beans cost pennies. The cornbread cost less. Together, they filled a table and stuck to your ribs until morning. Number 25. Tomato soup and grilled cheese. A can of condensed tomato soup, a can of water, heated on the stove while bread browned in a buttered skillet with cheese melting inside. This was a rainy day meal, a sick day meal, A meal for the afternoons when nobody felt like doing much and the kitchen was cold. She never followed the directions on the can. She added the water by feel and let it simmer until it coated the back of a spoon. The sandwich came out when the edges were crisp and the cheese pulled in long strings. Two things, both simple, both cheap, and together they became something no restaurant has ever improved on. She dipped the corner of the sandwich into the soup, and that was lunch. There was no culinary school for this, no certificate on the wall. The women who cooked these meals learned by standing next to their mothers and watching. They learned the sound of oil at the right temperature. They learned how much flour to grab without looking at a measuring cup. They learned to taste a pot of soup and know what it needed before they could name the ingredient. This was knowledge passed by proximity, not instruction. It lived in the wrist, in the fingers, in the moment she tilted the pan just right to keep the eggs from sticking. And because nobody ever wrote it down, it disappeared when the last woman who carried it stopped cooking. Number 24. Salmon patties. A can of pink salmon drained and dumped into a bowl with crushed saltine crackers and one beaten egg. She mixed it with her hands, shaped it into flat rounds, and fried them in a skillet with a little vegetable oil. The outside turned crisp and golden. The inside stayed soft and flaky. Some women added a squeeze of lemon. Others mixed in a spoonful of minced onion. The crackers held it all together, and the whole thing cooked in under 10 minutes. Salmon patties showed up on Friday nights across the country, partly out of tradition and partly because canned salmon was one of the cheapest proteins on the grocery shelf. 2 cans and a sleeve of crackers fed a family of 4. Number 23. Skillet hash. Canned beef broken apart with a fork mixed with diced boiled potatoes and a chopped onion, then pressed flat into a hot skillet greased with butter. She let the bottom crust form without touching it, and when she finally flipped sections with a spatula, the crispy parts were golden and almost crunchy. A fried egg sat on top if there were eggs to spare. This was a leftover meal at heart, built from whatever the pantry and the icebox had to offer. She did not consult a recipe because there was nothing to consult. You had canned beef, you had potatoes, you had a skillet. The meal built itself. Number 22. American goulash. Beef browned in a Dutch oven, a chopped onion softened in the drippings, a can of diced tomatoes poured over everything, and a box of elbow macaroni stirred in raw and left to cook right in the sauce. That was the recipe, and yet every woman who made it swore hers was different from the one next door. Some added a bay leaf. Some stirred in a spoonful of Worcestershire sauce. Some let it simmer until the macaroni absorbed all the liquid, and others kept it soupy enough to eat from a bowl with a spoon. The word goulash came from Hungary, but what American kitchens did with it bore no resemblance to the original. No paprika, no sour cream, no slow-braised shank. This was a new dish entirely, born from combining the 3 cheapest things at the grocery store when a family of 6 needed feeding on a Tuesday night. It showed up on kitchen tables in Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Pennsylvania so often that people forgot it had not always existed. The beauty of it was the math. A box of macaroni, a can of tomatoes, and whatever beef she could afford that week. That fed 6 people, and the leftovers were better than the first serving because the noodles soaked up every drop of sauce overnight in the refrigerator. Children grew up believing that elbow macaroni and tomato sauce was one of the oldest meals in the world. That connection existed only in the name. What stood in those Dutch ovens was something their mothers built out of necessity, and it worked so well that 3 generations later, people are still making it the same way, still without measuring a thing, and still certain that theirs is better than the one next door. Number 21. Pork chops and fried apples. 2 bone-in chops seasoned with salt and pepper and seared in a hot skillet until the fat rendered and the edges turned brown. She pulled the chops out and dropped sliced apples into the same pan, letting them soften in the pork fat with a spoonful of sugar and a shake of cinnamon. The apples cooked down until they were tender and golden, and the chops went back on top to finish together. This was an autumn supper built from what was in the yard and what was in the freezer. The sweetness of the fruit and the salt of the meat played off each other in a way no recipe card could teach. You learned it by tasting it once. Number 20. Sloppy Joes. Meat cooked down in a skillet, mixed with ketchup, a little mustard, brown sugar, and enough Worcestershire sauce to make the kitchen smell like a diner grill. She spooned it onto hamburger buns and handed them out wrapped in paper towels because there was no way to eat one without wearing half of it. This was the meal she made when the neighborhood kids were in the yard and she did not know exactly how many mouths she was feeding. One more squirt of ketchup, one more bun, and suddenly there was enough for 12. Nobody measured a single ingredient. Nobody had to. The proportions lived in her hands. Number 19. Potato soup. Potatoes peeled and cubed, dropped into a pot of salted water and boiled until they started falling apart. She mashed some against the side of the pot with a wooden spoon to thicken the broth, left the rest in chunks, and added butter and whole milk until it turned creamy. Salt, pepper, sometimes a handful of chopped celery if she had it. On cold nights, she served it with crackers or thick slices of bread, and the children drank the last of it straight from the bowl because the spoon could not reach it all. Potato soup was proof that a real meal could come from almost nothing. 5 ingredients, 1 pot, and everyone at the table felt warm before the dishes were done. A recipe card tells you what goes in the pot. It does not tell you how the kitchen smelled when your mother stood at the stove in January with the windows fogged and the radio playing low in the next room. It does not tell you she stirred with a wooden spoon older than you were, or that she tasted from the same spoon without thinking about it. The meals on this list were never just about the food. They were about the act of making something from nothing and setting it on a table where people you loved sat down together. That was the real recipe. The rest was just ingredients. Number 18. Tuna noodle casserole. Egg noodles boiled and drained, mixed with a can of tuna and mushroom soup straight from the pantry shelf, plus a handful of frozen peas. She poured it into a baking dish, crushed potato chips over the top for a crust, and slid it into the oven until it bubbled around the edges. The whole thing took 30 minutes and dirtied 2 pots and 1 dish. Families ate this once a week and nobody complained because the potato chip crust made it taste fancier than it had any right to be. The canned soup did all the work a homemade white sauce would have done, and she knew exactly how much noodle to cook without reading the side of the bag. Number 17. Chicken and dumplings. A whole chicken simmered in a pot of water with celery, onion, and salt until the meat fell off the bone. She pulled the bird out, stripped it by hand, and dropped the meat back into the broth. Then the dumplings, torn or dropped from a spoon, made from flour, baking powder, a pinch of salt, and enough milk to hold them together. They puffed up in the steam, and when the lid came off, the pot looked like a cloud floating on top of a golden stew. This was a winter meal that could warm a house with no central heating. The broth alone was worth the 3 hours it took, and not a drop of it went to waste. Number 16. Porcupine meatballs, seasoned beef kneaded together with raw rice, an egg, salt, pepper, and a little grated onion, shaped into balls and dropped into a pot of tomato sauce. As the meatballs cooked, the rice expanded and poked through the surface like quills, which is where the name came from. Children loved the name and loved the texture. Mothers loved how far a small amount of meat could stretch when half the meatball was rice. She simmered them covered for about 40 minutes until the rice was tender all the way through and the sauce had thickened around them. It looked like a meal that took real effort, but once the balls were in the pot, the stove did the rest. Number 15. Pan-fried liver. No other dish on this list divided a dinner table the way this one did. Half the family scraped their plates clean. The other half sat staring at it like a punishment. But the women who cooked it were not thinking about popularity. They were thinking about the fact that beef liver cost a fraction of what a roast did and carried enough iron to matter, which made a difference in households where a trip to the doctor was something you avoided as long as you could. She soaked the liver in milk for an hour to pull out the bitterness, then dredged it in seasoned flour and fried it in a hot skillet until the crust turned dark and crisp. Onions cooked low and slow in the same pan until they were soft, sweet, and nearly caramelized, piled on top with the pan juices poured over everything. The trick was never overcooking it. Liver that stayed in the pan too long turned gray and tough, and that was usually why people claimed they hated it. A woman who knew what she was doing pulled it out while the center was still barely pink. At that moment, the meat was tender, rich, and almost creamy. Nothing at all like the overcooked version that gave the dish its bad name. She never set a timer for this. She watched the color change, pressed the surface with the back of the spatula, and when it gave just slightly under the pressure, the liver was done. That kind of instinct took years to build, and no printed card could teach it to someone who had not stood at that stove long enough to learn. The butcher put liver on sale every Thursday because most customers walked past it. The women who knew better bought it for pennies and turned it into the most nourishing plate on the table that week. Their children complained. Their husbands ate seconds. Number 14. Macaroni and cheese. Not the kind from a box. The kind she made with a block of sharp cheddar grated by hand, a pot of elbow macaroni cooked until just barely tender, and a sauce built from butter, flour, and whole milk stirred until it coated the spoon. She layered noodles and cheese in a baking dish, poured the sauce over the top, and baked it until the surface turned golden and the edges bubbled. Some women added a beaten egg to make it set firmer. Others topped it with breadcrumbs. The boxed version arrived in the 1930s, but for decades after, plenty of women still made it the old way because no powder could match what a block of real cheese did in a hot oven. Number 13. Stuffed peppers. Green bell peppers with the tops cut off and the seeds scooped out, filled with a mixture of seasoned meat, cooked rice, diced onion, and tomato sauce, then stood upright in a baking dish and baked until the peppers softened and the filling cooked through. She spooned extra tomato sauce over the tops before they went into the oven. The whole thing came out looking like something from a restaurant, even though it cost next to nothing. This was a meal that used up leftover rice, stretched a small amount of beef, and put a vegetable on the table all at once. She never wrote down the proportions because they changed every time, depending on what was in the kitchen that day. Number 12. Spam and eggs. A can of Spam sliced into thick rectangles and fried in a skillet until both sides were crispy and caramelized. Eggs cracked into the same pan once the Spam was moved aside, fried in the rendered fat until the whites set. She served it with toast or biscuits, and the whole meal was on the table in under 10 minutes. Spam entered American kitchens during the Second World War and never left. It was cheap, it lasted on the shelf indefinitely, and children liked the salty taste of it browned in a hot pan. A single can and half a dozen eggs fed a family for less than a pound of bacon would have cost, and the entire recipe fit in 3 words: open, slice, fry. Somewhere around 1972 or 1973, the grocery store started changing. Frozen dinners took up more shelf space. Boxes with seasoning packets appeared next to the canned goods. Microwave ovens showed up in kitchens where a cast iron skillet had been the only cooking technology for decades. And the women who had cooked every meal from memory started stepping aside. Not because they wanted to, but because the world told them there was a faster way. The meals did not disappear overnight. They faded. One kitchen at a time, one generation at a time, one grandmother at a time, until the grandchildren did not even know the dishes had names. Number 11. Biscuits and sausage gravy. Breakfast sausage crumbled and browned in a skillet, flour stirred into the drippings until it turned into a thick paste. She poured in milk slowly, scraping the bottom to pull up the browned bits, and let it simmer until the gravy could hold a spoon upright. The biscuits she made by hand from flour, lard, buttermilk, and baking soda, patted out on the counter, and cut with a drinking glass because she never owned a biscuit cutter. She split them open and ladled gravy over the top until it ran down the sides and pooled on the plate. This was supper in every farmhouse that had a bag of flour and a roll of sausage in the icebox. Number 10. Country fried steak. A cheap cut of round steak pounded flat with a meat mallet until it was thin and tender, dipped in beaten egg, dredged in seasoned flour, and fried in a skillet with enough oil to come halfway up the sides. It came out golden and crunchy. She made cream gravy in the same pan with the leftover flour and drippings, stirring in milk until it thickened. The steak went on the plate, the gravy went over everything, and mashed potatoes sat beside it. This meal turned the cheapest piece of beef at the butcher counter into something that tasted like Sunday dinner. The pounding was the whole secret. Without it, the meat was tough enough to chew twice. Number 9. Skillet potatoes. Potatoes sliced thin, a yellow onion sliced the same way, both laid into a cast-iron skillet with bacon drippings and cooked over medium heat until the potatoes were soft inside and crisp on the edges. She turned them with a spatula every few minutes, salted them at the start and again at the end, and let the onion go translucent and sweet against the browned potato. That was the whole meal on some nights. Other nights it sat next to pork chops or fried eggs. Either way, the cast iron was the center of it all. Every kitchen had one, seasoned black from years of use, and this is exactly what it was made for. Number 8. Chili. No two pots of chili in America have ever tasted the same, and every woman who stood over the pot would have told you hers was the only version worth eating. Meat cooked down with onion, garlic, and chili powder, then canned tomatoes poured in, maybe kidney beans, maybe not. In Texas, beans in chili started arguments that outlasted the evening. In Ohio, they served it over spaghetti and topped it with shredded cheddar. In the small towns of the Midwest, it simmered all Saturday afternoon and went into heavy bowls with crackers crumbled on top. She never measured the chili powder. She shook it in, tasted, shook again, and stopped when the heat was right. The pot got better the longer it sat, and the leftovers were always better than the first serving because the flavors had all night to settle. Chili was the meal she made when she did not know how many people were coming because it stretched without losing anything. Another can of tomatoes, another handful of beef, and suddenly there was enough for 10. Cornbread went alongside more often than not, baked in the same cast iron she used for everything else. On a winter night with the windows steamed over and the cornbread cooling on the counter, a bowl of her chili could make you forget about anything that went wrong that day. And when somebody wanted the recipe, she just shrugged. Her hands did what they had always done, and the family always reached for seconds. Number 7. Beef stew. Chunks of cheap stewing beef browned in a pot, then potatoes, carrots, celery, and onion added in layers with enough water to cover everything. She let it simmer for hours, lifting the lid just long enough to stir and taste. The meat went in tough and came out soft enough to cut with a spoon. The broth thickened on its own from the starch in the potatoes, and by the time it was ready, the whole house smelled like someone had been cooking all day. She had been. Beef stew was not fast, but it was forgiving. She could leave it on the stove, hang laundry, come back, and it would be better than when she left it. Number 6. Creamed chipped beef on toast. Dried beef pulled apart by hand and simmered in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, poured over slices of toasted bread. The military had its own name for this, and the name was not polite, but the meal traveled from mess halls into family kitchens without losing a step. She bought the dried beef in small glass jars and could stretch one jar across 2 meals with enough sauce. The toast soaked up the gravy, the beef gave it salt and chew, and the whole plate looked plain but tasted like comfort. Plenty of men who served asked their wives to make it when they came home, and plenty of wives who never set foot on a base learned to make it anyway. Number 5. Meatloaf. Every woman in the country had her own version, and every one of them was sure hers was the best. Beef kneaded together with stale bread or crushed crackers, an egg, ketchup, salt, pepper, and whatever else she felt like adding. Some put in diced green pepper. Some stirred in a packet of onion soup mix. She shaped it by hand, spread ketchup or tomato sauce across the top, and baked it until the edges pulled away from the pan and the glaze turned dark. The center stayed moist if she did not leave it in too long. Served with mashed potatoes and green beans, this was the Tuesday night supper nobody tired of, because it turned out a little different every time. Number 4. Scrambled eggs with whatever was around. Eggs beaten in a bowl, poured into a buttered skillet, and stirred slowly while she tossed in whatever the icebox had left. Diced ham. a handful of cheese, chopped green onion from the garden, a cold biscuit crumbled straight in. Nothing was planned, nothing was measured, and nothing was wasted. This was the meal that appeared at the end of the week when the pantry was thin and payday was still a day away. She made it look intentional, but it was necessity dressed up in a warm skillet. The eggs stretched to cover whatever she put in, and everyone at the table ate without asking what was in it, because the answer changed every time. Number 3. Chicken soup. A whole chicken dropped into a pot of water with celery, onion, carrot, and enough salt to make the broth worth drinking on its own. She simmered it until the meat was ready to fall apart, pulled the bird out, stripped every bit of meat from the bones, and put it back. Egg noodles or rice went in near the end, depending on the family and the region. The broth was the thing. Clear, golden, rich with fat floating in small circles on the surface. She made this when someone was sick, when the weather turned, or when a whole chicken was the cheapest thing at the market. She did not learn how from a page. She learned it from her mother, who learned it from hers. Number 2. A bowl of white rice under gravy. Plain white rice cooked on the stove, topped with brown gravy made from pan drippings, flour, and water. That was the entire meal on plenty of nights. She stretched it by adding whatever meat had been cooked earlier in the week, or she served it exactly as it was, a deep bowl of starch and drippings with nothing else alongside. In Louisiana, this combination was almost its own food group. In the rest of the South, it appeared whenever the budget ran dry and the belly needed filling. The gravy carried the flavor of whatever had been cooked in that pan before, and the rice absorbed it all. No instructions existed because none were needed. Number 1. The everything pot. This was not a named recipe. It was what happened when a woman opened the icebox, looked at what was left, and decided whatever was there would become supper. A few potatoes, the end of an onion, half a can of tomatoes, a bone with some meat still on it. She put it all in one pot with water and salt and let it cook until it became something, and it always became something. That pot showed up in every kitchen on this list under a different name each time. Mulligan stew, icebox soup, clean out the fridge night. The women who made it never called it anything. They just called it supper. The people who ate it remember it better than any dish with a name, because that pot was about the woman who stood over it and turned nothing into enough. Scalloped potatoes with ham was a casserole Housewives assembled by instinct, layering sliced potatoes, diced leftover ham, and creamy sauce without measuring anything. The potatoes were sliced thin by hand, each cook knowing exactly the thickness that would cook through without becoming mushy. Between the layers went bits of ham from Sunday dinner, stretching one roast through multiple meals. The sauce was made from butter, flour, and milk in proportions learned by watching mothers work. Some added sliced onions between layers, while others kept it simple with salt and pepper. The casserole baked slowly until the potatoes were tender and the top turned golden brown with crispy edges that everyone fought over. This dish fed large families economically by using leftover meat and inexpensive potatoes. It could be assembled in the morning and baked before dinner, freeing housewives for other tasks. Scalloped potatoes appeared at church suppers and weeknight dinners throughout the decade. Today, this slow-baked comfort food rarely appears. Using leftover coffee grounds as a meat tenderizer was an unusual but surprisingly effective wartime kitchen hack. After brewing coffee, the spent grounds were saved instead of discarded, then used to tenderize tougher cuts of meat. The slightly abrasive texture helped break down fibers, while the natural acids in coffee softened the meat, improving texture and flavor. This trick allowed families to make the most of less expensive, tougher cuts, which were common during rationing. It was an easy, cost-free way to improve meals without needing special ingredients or equipment. The grounds could be rubbed directly onto meat or included in marinades, showing how every kitchen waste product was reimagined as a resource. This method reflected a larger trend of making do with what was available and finding hidden uses for ordinary items. Though it might sound strange today, it was one of many clever adaptations that helped stretch food budgets. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the simplest solutions can come from unexpected places. If you knew what a cushaw was, you were from the mountains, and that was all anyone needed to know about you. The cushaw squash was a massive, striped green and white gourd that could grow to 30 pounds or more on a single vine running wild through the garden. Mark Sohn documented it as one of the signature vegetables of Appalachian home cooking, a food so tied to the region that most people outside the mountains had never seen one. You split it with a hatchet because no kitchen knife was big enough, scoop the seeds, and bake the flesh until it turned soft and sweet as pumpkin, but lighter, smoother on the tongue. The casserole version mashed it with brown sugar, butter, cinnamon, and a little vanilla, then baked it in a dish until the top caramelized and the edges darkened to amber. Old-timers saved the seeds every year, passing them to neighbors, keeping the strain alive. When the last person who saved those seeds stopped planting, something older than any recipe disappeared with them. Rice pudding was a dessert Housewives made by combining leftover rice with milk, sugar, and eggs, then baking until set and creamy. The dish used rice that would otherwise sit in the icebox until it spoiled, transforming it into something sweet that children begged for. Housewives added cinnamon, nutmeg, and raisins by instinct, knowing the flavor profiles their families preferred. Some made it stovetop, stirring constantly until thick, while others preferred the oven method that required less attention. The pudding could be served warm or cold, making it versatile for different occasions. Leftover rice from weeknight dinners found new purpose in this economical dessert that tasted rich despite costing almost nothing extra. The technique passed through families without recipes because proportions adjusted based on how much rice was available. Housewives judged doneness by jiggling the pan and knowing when the center was set but still creamy. Rice pudding appeared at potlucks and family dinners throughout the 50s. Cooking with pressure. Cookers for efficiency became a valuable trick during World War II when fuel and time were limited. Pressure cookers reduced cooking times drastically by trapping steam and raising the boiling point of water. This meant tougher cuts of meat and dried beans could be prepared quickly, saving both energy and precious time. Many families learned to use pressure cookers to stretch ingredients further, making dishes that would otherwise take hours on the stove. These pots also helped preserve nutrients that might be lost during longer cooking. The ability to prepare a hearty meal fast was essential when rationing limited both fuel and food. Pressure cookers became common in wartime kitchens, praised for their practicality and convenience. Today, while electric appliances have taken over, the principles of pressure cooking remain a reminder of how innovation met necessity. Using a pressure cooker was not just about speed, it was about making the most of scarce resources and easing daily burdens in difficult times. She kept the canned salmon on the second shelf behind the pinto beans, and she only brought it down on Fridays. Salmon patty casserole was a Friday night staple in country homes where the pantry did more work than the icebox. The canned salmon, bones, skin, and all, got mashed with cracker crumbs, an egg, and a little grated onion, then pressed into a greased baking dish instead of shaped into patties. A can of cream of celery soup thinned with a splash of milk went over the top, and the whole thing baked until it bubbled and firmed up enough to slice. Some women laid sliced boiled eggs across the middle before pouring the soup over, a trick that made the casserole look planned instead of pulled together from what was on the shelf. The woman who taught you this is probably gone now. The canned salmon is still at the store, but nobody reaches for it the way she did, quick and sure, like she already knew what supper was before she opened the pantry door. Potato soup was a weeknight staple that housewives made by peeling potatoes, dicing them small, and simmering them with onions and milk until everything became soft and creamy. The soup required no recipe because every cook knew by instinct how much liquid to add and when the potatoes were done. Some housewives mashed part of the potatoes against the pot to thicken the broth while leaving chunks for texture. A generous amount of butter went in at the end, along with salt and pepper to taste. The soup was cheap, filling, and could stretch to feed unexpected guests by adding more milk. Celery or bacon were added when the pantry allowed, but the basic version needed nothing more than potatoes, onions, milk, and butter. Children ate it without complaint because the creamy texture felt comforting on cold evenings. This soup represented the practical wisdom of turning inexpensive vegetables into something rich and satisfying. Potato soup has faded from regular rotation in most modern homes. Creating homemade mustard from mustard seeds was a clever, cost-saving way to add flavor when store-bought condiments were scarce. Mustard seeds were inexpensive and could be ground at home to make fresh mustard pastes of varying heat and intensity. This homemade version was used to season meats, dress vegetables, and enliven sandwiches. Making mustard from scratch gave cooks control over the ingredients and helped avoid reliance on rationed or imported products. Mustard's sharpness also helped mask the blandness or substitutions often found in wartime dishes. Many families learned to prepare and store their own mustard, turning a simple seed into a pantry essential. This practice encouraged self-sufficiency and brought bold flavor to otherwise plain meals. Homemade mustard's popularity during the war reminds us that small touches can make a big difference in food enjoyment, especially when resources are tight. Yellow squash casserole showed up the moment the garden started producing faster than anyone could eat. You sliced it thin, no thicker than a nickel, because that was how the old women did it, and nobody argued with results. The squash went into a skillet with butter and sweet onion, cooked down just enough to lose its raw bite, but not so long it turned to mush. And knowing when to pull it off the heat was something you learned by standing at the stove, not from any book. The filling got folded with sour cream and cream of chicken soup, then buried under crushed Ritz crackers mixed with melted butter. That cracker crust came out golden and shattered when you pressed a spoon through it. Every church supper in the rural South had at least two on the table by the 1970s, and the women who brought them knew whose was better without anyone saying a word. Most people overcook the squash now or skip the crackers entirely, and what comes out of the oven is close, but never the same. Salmon patties were Friday night tradition in countless American homes, shaped by hand from canned salmon mixed with crushed crackers, beaten egg, and whatever seasonings the pantry offered. Housewives learned the proportions through repetition, knowing exactly how much cracker crumbs made patties that held together. The salmon was mashed with a fork, bones and all, since the soft bones provided calcium that children needed. Each patty was formed into a round disc and fried in butter until golden brown on both sides. These patties stretched a single can into enough protein for a family of 5 when served alongside mashed potatoes. Catholic families made them every Friday during Lent. Some housewives added minced onion for extra crunch, while purists kept it simple. Salmon patties required no written instructions because every mother taught her daughter by standing beside her at the stove, demonstrating the flip that kept patties intact. This economical dish has faded from most modern kitchens. Using gelatin to set leftover meat juices was an ingenious way to transform scraps into a new dish that stretched ingredients further. After roasting or boiling meat, the remaining juices were collected and combined with gelatin, which was more commonly used in wartime cooking than it is now. This mixture was poured into molds and refrigerated, creating savory aspics that could be sliced and served. These dishes added variety to meals and made use of parts that might otherwise be discarded. Gelatin helped preserve the nutrients and flavors, providing protein-rich options even when fresh meat was limited. The resulting aspics were often mixed with chopped vegetables, eggs, or bits of meat, making them more appealing and hearty. This technique reflected the resourcefulness of wartime kitchens, where wasting any part of food was unacceptable. Aspics served cold also offered a refreshing change in warmer months. Although gelatin dishes have faded from modern menus, they once held a respected place at tables across America. Rediscovering this trick shows how creativity and respect for ingredients helped families survive with less. Cornbread dressing casserole started the day before, always the day before, because the cornbread had to go stale. You baked a full skillet of buttermilk cornbread, crumbled it by hand into a bowl the size of a washtub, and let it sit on the counter overnight with a towel draped across the top. The next morning came the sage, rubbed sage, never ground because ground sage turned bitter and only someone who had never made dressing would use it. The broth came from giblets and the neck simmered low with onion and celery until the kitchen smelled like Thanksgiving even if it was just a Tuesday. Eggs bound it, and the whole thing went into a cast-iron skillet greased with bacon drippings. It baked until the top went crisp and dark while the center stayed soft and almost custard-like. Every family had their own version, and every family believed theirs was the only right one. When the woman who made it passed, Thanksgiving lost something the recipe card could never give back. Wacky cake was a chocolate cake housewives made during the war years and kept making through the 50s because it required no eggs, butter, or milk. The recipe was mixed directly in the baking pan, creating 3 wells in the dry ingredients where vinegar, vanilla, and oil were poured before water was added. The chemical reaction between vinegar and baking soda made the cake rise without eggs, producing a tender crumb. Housewives memorized the proportions because the recipe was so simple and the results so reliable. The cake was moist and chocolatey, perfect for school lunches or weeknight desserts when fancier cakes seemed like too much work. Some called it crazy cake, but every version used the same basic technique of mixing in the pan. Children never knew they were eating a Depression-era survival recipe because it tasted just as good as any layer cake. Wacky cake represented ingenuity, proving that limitations could produce something genuinely delicious. This clever cake has faded from memory. Making hobo stew with mixed vegetables and meat scraps was a one-pot meal that brought together whatever was on hand to feed families efficiently. This stew combined less desirable cuts of meat, leftover vegetables, and pantry staples simmered slowly to develop flavor and tenderness. The name reflected its humble origins, but the dish was hearty and comforting. Using a single pot minimized fuel usage and cleanup time, which were valuable considerations during wartime. The flexible recipe meant cooks could adapt it to what was available, reducing waste and stretching ingredients. Hobo stew embodied the spirit of making do with less and turning scarcity into sustenance. Its warming qualities made it a favorite in many homes, especially during cold months. Today, it stands as a symbol of resilience and practical cooking wisdom from a time when every morsel mattered. Cabbage roll casserole was what happened when a woman loved the flavor of stuffed cabbage but had 4 kids to feed and no time to roll anything. The original stuffed cabbage came from Eastern European immigrants, Polish, Czech, Hungarian families who settled across Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley to work the mines and the mills. Their wives rolled seasoned meat and rice inside blanched cabbage leaves and simmered them in tomato sauce for hours. The casserole version took the same ingredients: ground beef, chopped cabbage, rice, condensed tomato soup, and a pour of beef broth, and layered them raw in a baking dish. It went into the oven for 90 minutes and came out tasting like somebody had been cooking all day. You never told company it only took 15 minutes to assemble. That was the unspoken rule of country casserole cooking. The less effort it looked like, the more it impressed, and nobody ever asked how you pulled it off. Hot dog and bean casserole was a crowd-pleasing dinner that housewives assembled without measuring, combining canned baked beans with sliced hot dogs in a baking dish. The hot dogs were cut into coins or split lengthwise, then nestled into the beans before baking. Brown sugar, mustard, and ketchup were stirred into the beans to create a sweet and tangy sauce that caramelized around the edges. Some housewives topped the casserole with bacon strips for extra flavor. The dish baked until bubbling and slightly browned, filling the kitchen with an aroma that brought children running. This casserole stretched inexpensive ingredients into a meal that felt festive, often appearing at backyard barbecues. The proportions varied by family and by how many mouths needed feeding. Housewives knew by experience how much sweetness to add and when the casserole was done. Hot dog and bean casserole represented practical cooking that turned simple ingredients into something everyone loved. This comfort food has faded from family tables. Hash brown funeral potatoes earned their name the hard way. They showed up after someone died. The recipe started in Mormon communities in Utah, where it was a fixture at post-funeral luncheons, but by the middle of the 1970s, it had spread through church basements and potluck tables across the rural South and Midwest. The whole thing was built from frozen shredded hash browns, sour cream, a can of cream of chicken soup, a heavy pour of shredded cheddar, and a topping of crushed cornflakes fried in melted butter until they crisped into something almost candy-like. What walked into the kitchen as a bag of frozen potatoes and a stack of canned goods walked out of the oven as something rich and golden and deeply comforting. The kind of dish that could make a grieving family sit down and eat when nothing else could. The cornflake crust was the secret. Without it, you just had cheesy potatoes. With it, you had the dish that said somebody cared enough to bring their best to your worst day. Cubed steak with gravy was a weeknight dinner that housewives made by pounding cheap cuts of beef until tender, then frying them and smothering them in homemade gravy. The meat was seasoned with salt and pepper, dredged in flour, and browned in hot fat until a crust formed on both sides. The steaks were removed while the gravy was made in the same pan, using flour and milk stirred into the drippings until thick. Everything went back together, the steaks simmering in gravy until the meat was fork tender. This dish turned tough, inexpensive meat into something that felt almost luxurious. Housewives knew by sight when the gravy was thick enough and by touch when the meat was tender. The technique required no written instructions because mothers stood beside daughters at the stove, teaching the feel of proper gravy consistency. Served over mashed potatoes or egg noodles, cubed steak stretched the grocery budget while satisfying appetites. This practical dish has largely disappeared. Making war ration sandwich spreads was a clever way to turn limited ingredients into something satisfying. People would blend canned fish, often salmon or mackerel, with whatever vegetables were on hand, like pickles or onions. Mayonnaise substitutes made from rationed ingredients helped bind it all together. This mixture stretched thinly over bread, turning simple sandwiches into meals that could fill bellies without breaking wartime restrictions. The beauty of these spreads was their adaptability. If fresh produce was scarce, canned or preserved vegetables stepped in. The result was a flavorful, nutritious option that made the most of pantry staples. These spreads were also easy to prepare, which helped busy families feed themselves quickly. They became a staple at lunchtime tables across the country, proving that resourcefulness could turn the leanest rations into something worth eating. The practice encouraged creativity and minimized waste, both essential during the war. Today, these simple sandwich spreads remind us of a time when making do was not just a choice, but a necessity. Trying out these recipes can give us a taste of resilience and cleverness from kitchens of the past. Hash from leftover roast was Monday dinner in homes across America, made by chopping Sunday's beef or pork into small pieces and frying it with diced potatoes and onions. Housewives eyeballed the proportions, using however much meat remained and enough potatoes to stretch it into a full meal. The mixture was pressed into a hot skillet with bacon drippings, then left undisturbed until the bottom formed a crispy brown crust. The flip required confidence, turning the entire mass to crisp the other side. Some housewives added a fried egg on top, the runny yolk becoming sauce for the hash beneath. Hash represented the practical wisdom of using every scrap of expensive meat rather than letting it spoil. Children grew up eating it without realizing they were eating leftovers, since the transformation was complete. This technique required no recipe because the proportions adjusted naturally to whatever remained from Sunday dinner. Hash has largely vanished from modern tables. Cooking cornmeal. Spoon bread as a bread substitute was a clever way to fill the gap when traditional bread was scarce during wartime. Spoon bread was a soft, moist-baked dish made from cornmeal, milk, eggs, and butter or fat, creating a texture somewhere between cornbread and a soufflé. This dish was easy to make with pantry staples and required less flour than typical bread recipes, making it perfect for rationing times. Spoon bread was served alongside soups, stews, and main dishes, providing a comforting and filling accompaniment. Its creamy texture and mild flavor made it a favorite substitute for conventional bread, which was often unavailable or in limited supply. This recipe also showcased the versatility of cornmeal, an inexpensive and widely available ingredient that became a backbone for many wartime meals. Spoon bread required simple equipment and minimal preparation time, fitting well into the busy schedules of wartime cooks. Today, it is remembered as a nostalgic comfort food, a symbol of how kitchens adapted with creative substitutes to maintain hearty meals. If cabbage rolls taught you how to stretch a meal, 7-layer casserole taught you how to stretch a prayer. The whole trick was that the rice went in raw, uncooked, straight from the box, and the liquid from the tomato sauce and the fat from the bacon on top cooked it in the baking dish. You layered it in order, and you did not skip a step. Rice on the bottom, then ground beef crumbled raw, then tomato sauce, then onion rings, then bell pepper rings, then celery, then strips of raw bacon draped across the top like a blanket. Covered tight with foil, it baked for 2 hours, and the whole house filled with a smell that brought the kids in from the yard without being called. The recipe showed up in community cookbooks all through the 1960s and 70s, always handwritten, always from someone named Dorothy or Mildred. It cost almost nothing. It fed almost everyone. Wilted lettuce salad appeared on dinner tables, when garden lettuce grew faster than families could eat it fresh. Housewives tore crisp lettuce into a large bowl, then poured hot bacon drippings mixed with vinegar and sugar directly over the greens. The heat wilted the lettuce just enough to soften it, while the dressing created a tangy sweetness that balanced the smoky bacon flavor. Crumbled bacon pieces and sliced hard-boiled eggs topped the salad, transforming simple greens into something substantial. This was country cooking that required no recipe because farm wives had made it for generations. The proportions of vinegar to sugar varied by family taste, some preferring more tang while others liked it sweeter. The bacon grease had to be hot enough to wilt, but not so hot it cooked the lettuce completely. The salad was served immediately while still warm, before the lettuce became too soft. This dish has largely vanished as fresh salads and bottled dressings became standard fare. Making soup stock from watermelon rinds was an inventive way to use parts of food that would normally be thrown away, adding flavor and substance to meals. During times of scarcity, nothing was wasted, and watermelon rinds, often discarded, became a valuable ingredient in homemade soup stocks. The rinds imparted a subtle sweetness and body to broths, while extending the volume of soup without extra cost. Combining these with vegetable scraps or bones created a nourishing base for soups and stews. This practice illustrated the wartime mindset of resourcefulness and frugality, where every part of food was utilized to its fullest. Using watermelon rinds helped stretch limited supplies and added variety to diets that were often repetitive. This little-known trick was popular in regions where watermelons were abundant during summer months, and families preserved rinds by drying or pickling them for later use. Making stock this way not only conserved food but also demonstrated the ingenuity of cooks who made the best of their circumstances. Before there were freezers, before there were pressure canners, there were shucky beans, green beans strung on thread with a needle and hung from porch rafters until they dried into something that looked like shriveled leather and smelled like the memory of summer. The Cherokee are often credited with teaching settlers the practice, though German immigrants from the Palatinate brought a near-identical tradition called Getrocknet Bohnen, and somewhere in the mountains the two methods became one. To make the casserole, you soaked the dried beans overnight, then simmered them for hours with a chunk of fatback until they turned silky and rich, deeper than fresh green beans, almost tannic, tasting of smoke and thyme and the barn roof where they dried in August heat. A cornbread batter poured over the top and baked until golden turned it into a one-dish meal. What started as a way to survive winter became the dish families requested at every holiday. Fried cornmeal mush was a breakfast housewives made from the simplest ingredients, cooking cornmeal in water until thick, then chilling it overnight before slicing and frying. The mush was poured into a loaf pan after cooking, where it set into a firm block that could be sliced the next morning. Each slice was fried in butter or bacon drippings until golden and crispy on both sides, the exterior crackling while the inside stayed soft. Housewives served it with maple syrup or alongside eggs and bacon for a hearty morning meal. The technique required no recipe because the proportions were simple, and the method was learned by watching. Cornmeal was cheap and filling, making this dish a budget-friendly way to feed hungry families before school. Children loved the contrast between crispy edges and tender centers. This dish stretched back generations, connecting 50s families to grandparents who survived harder times. Fried cornmeal mush has nearly vanished from modern breakfast tables. Substituting butter with bacon drippings for cooking was a tasty and efficient way to replace scarce fats. Butter was rationed during World War II, forcing cooks to seek alternatives that could provide flavor and needed fat for cooking and baking. Bacon drippings, the fat rendered after frying bacon, were collected and saved for reuse in frying vegetables, seasoning beans, or baking savory dishes. This leftover fat added a smoky richness to meals that butter sometimes could not provide. Using bacon drippings was economical, preventing waste and making the most of limited resources. Families learned to store drippings carefully, sometimes mixing them with other fats to stretch them further. This substitution became a staple of wartime kitchens, balancing scarcity with flavor. Today, it serves as a reminder that necessity often inspires delicious creativity, turning something left over into a prized cooking ingredient. Scalloped corn came together in a mixing bowl with the kind of ingredients that never needed a recipe card. Whole kernel corn drained and saved, cream-style corn from the can, eggs cracked in one-handed evaporated milk, and a sleeve of saltine crackers crushed by fist inside the bag. In parts of Ohio and the rural Midwest, Swiss cheese got folded in, a tradition that likely came from the Amish communities who sold their cheese at local markets for almost nothing. The casserole baked at 325 until it set like a custard in the center and turned golden at the edges. You tested it the same way you tested cornbread, a bump of the pan, watching to see if the middle still shook. Your grandmother made this for Thanksgiving and Christmas without fail, and the dish came to the table in the same ceramic baking pan every single year. She never wrote the recipe down because she never needed to. After she was gone, 3 different cousins tried to make it from memory. None of them got it right. Tomato soup cake was a chocolate-colored spice cake that housewives made using a can of condensed tomato soup as the secret ingredient. The soup added moisture and tanginess that made the cake incredibly tender without anyone guessing what was inside. Housewives mixed the soup with flour, sugar, baking soda, and spices like cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg, creating a batter that baked into something rich. Raisins or chopped nuts were folded in when available. The cake was often topped with cream cheese frosting, though many families ate it plain or dusted with powdered sugar. This recipe spread through communities during the Depression and remained popular through the 50s. Children never suspected tomato soup was involved. They just knew the cake was delicious. The technique required no precise measurements because housewives adjusted the spices to family preference. Tomato soup cake represented the ingenuity of making something special from ordinary ingredients. This clever cake has largely disappeared. Using cabbage leaves as wraps for stuffed vegetables was a natural and economical way to hold ingredients together during times of scarcity. Large cabbage leaves served as edible containers for mixtures of grains, vegetables, and sometimes small amounts of meat. Wrapping dishes this way conserved cooking vessels and made serving easier. The leaves added a mild, fresh flavor and extra fiber to meals. Cabbage was widely available, inexpensive, and hearty, making it a perfect vegetable to support this technique. Stuffed cabbage leaves were filling and visually appealing, offering a sense of comfort despite limited ingredients. This method also reflected the wartime emphasis on stretching every resource without waste. Many families passed down recipes that used cabbage wraps, keeping the tradition alive long after rationing ended. Revisiting this trick today reveals how simple, affordable vegetables became heroes in kitchens facing adversity. Milk toast was the ultimate comfort food that mothers made for sick children without ever consulting a recipe. This simple dish required nothing more than toasted bread torn into pieces and placed in a bowl, then covered with warm milk, a pat of butter, and a sprinkle of sugar or salt. The bread softened into something between soup and cereal, easy to digest and gentle on upset stomachs. Housewives learned this from their own mothers during childhood illnesses, and the technique never needed writing down. The warm milk soothed sore throats, while the butter added richness that made medicine go down easier. Doctors recommended milk toast for patients recovering from surgery throughout the decade. Children who grew up eating it during measles remembered the taste decades later as pure maternal love in a bowl. The dish cost almost nothing and used ingredients every kitchen stocked. Today, milk toast has vanished from American tables, replaced by canned soups that lack the personal touch. Stretching meatloaf with oats or breadcrumbs was a common tactic to make meat supplies go further during the shortages. When meat was scarce and expensive, people found that adding oats or breadcrumbs bulked up the mixture, making a smaller amount of ground meat feed a whole family. These fillers were inexpensive and readily available, making them perfect wartime kitchen helpers. Oats added texture and absorbed flavors, while breadcrumbs helped bind the loaf together, keeping it moist and filling. Seasonings and vegetables mixed in also helped improve the taste and nutritional value. This clever trick allowed households to serve a classic comfort food without using as much precious meat. It also introduced more fiber and whole grains into the diet, which was an unintended bonus. The stretched meatloaf became a symbol of frugality and culinary ingenuity, showing how people adapted familiar recipes to hard times. It was a meal that provided warmth and sustenance when resources were limited. Trying this method today offers a glimpse into how much thought went into conserving food during those challenging years. The kitchens that grew cushaw in the garden often kept a crock of sauerkraut in the cellar, and what came out of that crock fed families through winters that started early and ended late. Kraut and Wiener casserole was German Appalachian cooking at its most practical, a dish built from two things that kept almost forever and cost next to nothing. The sauerkraut came from a stoneware crock where cabbage had been salted and pressed and left to ferment for weeks in the root cellar, and the wieners were the cheapest protein at the general store. You layered them in a baking dish with caraway seeds, a little brown sugar to cut the sourness, and sometimes sliced potatoes if the family was large and the wieners were few. It showed up in every holler and every coal camp kitchen from eastern Kentucky to southern West Virginia. It smelled sharp and sour, and it tasted like the kind of meal that got you through February. Welsh rarebit was a cheese sauce poured over toast that housewives made for quick suppers when time and groceries ran short. Sharp cheddar cheese was melted with butter, a splash of beer or milk, and seasonings like mustard and Worcestershire sauce until smooth. The sauce was spooned over thick slices of toasted bread, sometimes with a poached egg on top for extra protein. The dish felt elegant despite its simplicity, the rich cheese sauce transforming ordinary toast into something special. Housewives made it by feel, knowing how much liquid created the right consistency. Welsh rarebit appeared on dinner tables when the icebox was nearly empty, and shopping day was still ahead. Children loved the gooey cheese, while adults appreciated how quickly it came together. The technique passed through families without written recipes because the method was straightforward. Welsh rarebit represented the art of elevating simple ingredients into satisfying meals. This quick supper dish has largely disappeared from American kitchens. Making fruit butter from overripe fruit was a smart way to turn imperfect or aging fruit into a delicious and long-lasting spread. Instead of letting fruit go to waste, wartime cooks slowly cooked down overripe apples, peaches, or pears with just a small amount of sugar to create a thick, flavorful butter. The low sugar content was intentional, as sugar was rationed and often in short supply, so cooks had to find ways to sweeten food without using much of it. This spread could be used on bread, served with biscuits, or added to breakfast dishes, giving meals extra flavor and variety. The process also helped preserve the fruit for longer periods, making it a practical pantry staple. Families often experimented with whatever fruit was on hand, and the resulting fruit butters became a cherished way to stretch food supplies while still enjoying sweet flavors. Making fruit butter was a testament to the creativity in wartime kitchens, turning potential waste into something nourishing and tasty. This tradition carries on in many homes today, keeping the spirit of resourcefulness alive. Creamed peas on toast was a weeknight staple that housewives assembled in minutes without measuring cups or recipe cards. A can of peas was drained and stirred into a simple white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, whisked together until thick. The creamy mixture was spooned over slices of toasted bread, creating a meal that satisfied hungry families when the grocery budget ran thin. This dish appeared on tables across America during the early 50s, especially toward the end of the month when paychecks stretched tight. Housewives made the white sauce by feel, knowing exactly when the flour was cooked enough and the milk had thickened properly. The peas added color and sweetness while the toast soaked up every drop. Some mothers added diced hard-boiled eggs when extra protein was needed. The dish represented practical cooking at its finest, turning pantry basics into something that tasted far better than its humble ingredients suggested. Creamed peas on toast has quietly disappeared from family tables. Making potato soup, thickened with flour and milk powder, was a wartime adaptation to create a creamy, filling soup using ration-friendly ingredients. Potatoes, abundant and inexpensive, formed the base of the soup, while flour and powdered milk replaced scarce fresh cream or butter to thicken and enrich the dish. This hearty soup provided warmth and sustenance, making it popular in homes coping with rationing and limited food variety. The use of powdered milk was especially important because fresh dairy was often unavailable or reserved for military use. Flour added body, creating a smooth texture that could satisfy hungry families. Cooks often added whatever vegetables were available to boost nutrition, making the soup both economical and practical. This soup became a comforting staple in many households, illustrating how simple substitutions could maintain flavor and nutrition despite shortages. Today, potato soup remains beloved, but the wartime versions highlight a time when ingenuity and necessity shaped recipes in ways we rarely think about now. Bread pudding transformed stale bread into dessert through a technique passed from generation to generation without written instructions. Housewives tore dried bread into chunks and soaked them in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla until softened completely. The exact proportions depended on how much stale bread had accumulated. Cinnamon and nutmeg added warmth, while raisins provided bursts of sweetness throughout. The mixture was poured into a buttered baking dish and baked until puffed and golden, the top forming a slight crust while the inside stayed custardy. Some families served it warm with cream poured over, others preferred it cold the next morning for breakfast. The dish represented the waste-nothing philosophy that defined post-war kitchens. Every scrap of bread found purpose in this humble dessert that tasted far more elegant than its origin suggested. Bread pudding required no recipe because every housewife knew by touch when the bread was properly soaked and by sight when the pudding was done. Fermenting vegetables for flavor and preservation was a critical wartime kitchen trick that helped families avoid store scarcity and add zest to their meals. Home fermentation produced staples like sauerkraut and pickles, which not only lasted longer without refrigeration, but also provided essential vitamins during times when fresh produce was limited. The fermentation process enhanced the flavor and digestibility of vegetables, turning simple cabbage or cucumbers into tangy, nutritious accompaniments. Many families set up fermentation crocks or jars to make batches that could be consumed over months. This preservation method allowed people to enjoy variety in their diet and helped prevent nutritional deficiencies. Fermented foods became a common sight on wartime tables, especially in immigrant communities that brought traditional recipes and techniques from Europe. This trick was inexpensive and sustainable, making it an indispensable part of wartime food culture. Fermentation also fostered a sense of self-sufficiency and was a source of pride for home cooks who could turn humble ingredients into delicious and healthy foods. Not one of these suppers started with a cookbook. They started with a woman who already knew. Try the goulash if you have beef in the fridge. Try the salmon patties if you want something your family will talk about at the table. And if one of these brought back a memory, put the name of the dish in the comments. Hit subscribe, and until next time, take care of yourself.